The wind carried dust like whispers across the wooden boardwalks of Copper Ridge, a town stitched together by gamblers, miners, drifters, and ghosts of promises broken before sunrise. The Red Lantern Saloon stood at the heart of it, its swinging doors groaning day and night like they had something to confess, but never found the courage inside. Music from a worn-out piano limped through the smoky air while laughter and arguments tangled like barbed wire. Among the chaos moved Clara Bell, known to most as just Clara, the saloon girl who wore kindness like it was stitched into her skin. She floated between tables in her crimson dress, refilling whiskey glasses and offering smiles that seemed to calm even the roughest cowhands. Clara had arrived in Copper Ridge 3 years earlier, alone and penniless, yet she had never learned how to say no to someone hungry, cold, or broken. That morning, the saloon was quieter than usual. Most patrons were still nursing hangovers or chasing gold dreams in the hills. Clara wiped down tables while old Manny, the bartender whose beard held more gray than black, polished glasses behind the counter. The scent of stale beer and sawdust hung thick in the air. Clara hummed softly, a tune she barely remembered from childhood, when the doors creaked open and the wind dragged in a figure who looked less like a man and more like a forgotten memory. He was tall but bent slightly forward, as if carrying years on his back. His coat was torn, boots cracked, and a hat sat low enough to hide his eyes. Dust coated him so heavily he looked carved from the desert itself. The room fell silent, not from fear, but from that peculiar discomfort people feel when confronted with someone who mirrors their worst future. The drifter moved slowly toward a corner table, each step sounding heavier than it should have. He sat, without a word, placing a trembling hand on the table as if checking whether it was real. Clara noticed him instantly. She always noticed the ones no one else wanted to see. She approached gently, her voice soft but steady. She asked if he wanted something to drink. The man looked up briefly, revealing eyes the color of storm clouds before rain. He shook his head and said he only wanted breakfast, though his voice sounded like gravel dragged across iron. Manny leaned toward Clara and whispered that the man clearly had no money and would only bring trouble. Clara ignored him, the same way she ignored every warning that tried to harden her heart. She nodded at the drifter and promised to bring him food. In the kitchen, Clara prepared eggs, biscuits, and bacon, using her own saved coins to cover the cost. The cook raised an eyebrow but said nothing, accustomed to her quiet rebellions. As she worked, she studied the worn coins she kept in a small pouch, each one representing hours of dancing with men whose hands smelled of gunpowder and regret. She knew she couldn't save everyone, but she also believed hunger was a cruelty no one deserved. When she returned to the table, she placed the plate before the drifter carefully, as if setting down something sacred. The man stared at the food like it might disappear if he blinked. He removed his hat slowly, revealing silver-streaked hair and a scar running along his temple. He nodded once, deeply, before beginning to eat with the desperate grace of someone trying to remain dignified while starvation clawed at his ribs. Clara watched him from a distance while pretending to tidy nearby chairs. Something about the man unsettled her, though she couldn't explain why. It wasn't fear. It was a strange feeling, like standing near a thunderstorm that hadn't decided whether to strike. The drifter ate methodically, never rushing, never wasting a crumb. When he finished, he wiped his mouth with a sleeve that had once been fine wool before time chewed it into threads. He rose and approached Clara, towering despite his weary posture. He reached into his coat, causing Manny to stiffen and reach for the shotgun beneath the counter. Instead of a weapon, the man pulled out a small, weathered coin bearing a faded crest unfamiliar to Clara. He placed it in her palm, closing her fingers around it with surprising gentleness, and said it was all he had left but carried more weight than gold if she ever needed it. Before Clara could respond, the drifter turned and walked toward the door. The wind swallowed him the moment he stepped outside, leaving only footprints already fading in the dust. Clara stared at the coin, noticing the intricate engraving of a falcon clutching crossed rifles, along with words she could barely read beneath years of wear. Manny scoffed, telling her she had wasted good money feeding another wandering corpse, who would likely be dead in a ditch by sunset. Clara ignored him again, though this time she felt a chill she couldn't explain. She slipped the coin into her pouch, sensing it carried a story heavier than the man who had given it. Outside, clouds gathered along the horizon, thick and slow-moving, like trouble making its patient way toward Copper Ridge, unaware that the smallest act of kindness inside the Red Lantern Saloon had just stirred forces older than the town itself. Copper Ridge woke slowly beneath a bruised sky, the kind that threatened rain but delivered only humidity and unease. Clara arrived at the Red Lantern Saloon earlier than usual, the strange coin still pressing against her thoughts like a splinter she couldn't remove. She had examined it half the night by candlelight, tracing the falcon and crossed rifles, trying to recall whether she had ever seen the crest in town. She hadn't. The miners used company tokens, gamblers traded silver dollars, and ranchers dealt mostly in handwritten notes and cattle brands. This coin belonged to something older, something organized, and perhaps something dangerous. When she stepped inside the saloon, she found Manny arguing with a pair of freight riders about unpaid tabs, yet his usual gruff confidence seemed thinner. Rumors had crept through town overnight like rats through flour sacks. Whispers about riders seen circling the outskirts of Copper Ridge, men dressed to clean to be outlaws, but too armed to be merchants. By mid-morning, the saloon filled with its usual blend of exhaustion and desperation. Piano keys clattered while dice clicked across tabletops, and smoke curled lazily toward ceiling beams blackened by decades of poor decisions. Clara worked steadily, but her eyes kept drifting toward the door, half expecting the drifter to return, or perhaps collapse just outside. Instead, a group of 3 well-dressed strangers entered together. Their coats were tailored, their boots polished, and their eyes carried the careful calm of men accustomed to violence but unwilling to rush it. The tallest among them removed his gloves finger by finger while scanning the room as though cataloging every soul inside. They ordered whiskey without glancing at the menu and spoke in low tones that made nearby patrons shift uncomfortably. Clara felt an unfamiliar tension coil in her stomach as she approached them, offering her usual warm greeting, though her voice sounded distant to her own ears. The tall stranger asked Clara whether a man matching the drifter's description had visited the saloon the previous morning. His tone was polite, yet it held an edge sharper than broken glass. Clara hesitated only a fraction of a second before answering truthfully. That many drifters passed through, and she rarely remembered their faces. The stranger smiled, but it was a smile that never reached his eyes. He thanked her and placed a silver coin on the table as a tip, though Clara noticed it lacked the falcon crest. As she walked away, she felt their gaze following her, measuring her honesty against something she could not see. Manny muttered under his breath that those men smelled like law, but carried themselves like kings. Clara pretended not to hear, yet her pulse quickened as she wondered why men of that presence would care about one starving drifter who could barely stand outside the saloon. The town stirred with restless energy. Riders arrived carrying crates marked with unfamiliar brands. Store owners whispered to one another before closing early, and even the sheriff spent more time pacing the boardwalk than sitting in his office. Clara stepped out briefly to catch her breath, and as she leaned against a post, she noticed an elderly stable boy staring at her with wide eyes. He shuffled closer and asked whether she had spoken to the old man who came through yesterday. When she admitted she had, the boy told her he overheard ranch hands discussing a powerful landholder rumored to travel in disguise, a man who quietly owned grazing rights, rail contracts, and mining claims stretching across 3 territories. Clara laughed softly, assuming it was another exaggerated frontier legend. But the boy insisted the man was known for testing people through acts of poverty before deciding who could be trusted with opportunity or crushed beneath it. That evening, tension inside the Red Lantern thickened like storm clouds gathering inside wooden walls. The 3 strangers remained seated at their table for hours, drinking little yet observing everything. One of them occasionally glanced toward Clara's pouch as if he could sense the coin hidden inside. Meanwhile, gamblers argued louder than usual, and 2 miners nearly drew pistols over a disputed hand of cards before Manny slammed a bottle between them to restore fragile peace. Clara continued working, though her mind replayed the drifters, storm-colored eyes, and the gentle way he had closed her fingers around the coin. She began to wonder whether she had stepped unknowingly into a story far larger than Copper Ridge, a story written by men whose names never appeared on wanted posters, because they owned the printing presses. Near closing time, a rider galloped into town, horse foaming with sweat and fear. He burst through the saloon doors shouting that a heavily guarded caravan had been spotted cresting the northern ridge, escorted by armed riders wearing black coats stitched with the falcon emblem. The room fell into stunned silence as every patron turned toward Clara, without fully understanding why. She felt heat rise in her cheeks and instinctively touched the pouch at her waist. The three strangers stood simultaneously, exchanging glances that carried both satisfaction and urgency. Outside, thunder rolled across the desert, low and deliberate, as if announcing the arrival of something inevitable. Clara remained frozen behind the bar, realizing that the coin resting against her hip might not simply be a token of gratitude but a key. And keys had a dangerous way of unlocking doors that could never be closed again. The thunder that rolled across Copper Ridge that night did not bring rain. Instead, it carried the echo of hooves striking hardened earth, steady and organized, like drums announcing a monarch's arrival. Townsfolk poured into the streets, drawn by curiosity and dread. In equal measure, lanterns flickered as riders appeared along the northern ridge, their silhouettes framed against lightning that flashed without rain. Clara stood in the doorway of the Red Lantern Saloon beside Manny, her breath shallow as she counted nearly 20 mounted figures descending toward town. Each rider wore a long black coat, their collars embroidered with the falcon clutching crossed rifles. The emblem glowed faintly under torchlight, identical to the coin hidden in Clara's pouch. The caravan they escorted was no ordinary freight train. Polished wagons reinforced with iron plating rolled behind them, guarded by men who skinned rooftops and alleyways with the discipline of trained soldiers. The caravan halted in the center of Copper Ridge, directly beneath the town's rusted clock tower that had not worked in 15 years. One rider dismounted and struck the ground twice with the butt of his rifle, a signal that silenced murmuring crowds. The three well-dressed strangers who had lingered in the saloon earlier stepped forward from the shadows, as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. They approached the lead wagon and removed their hats respectfully. A tense stillness settled over the town as the wagon door creaked open. For several seconds, no one stepped out. Then a familiar boot touched the dirt, cracked leather now freshly polished. The old drifter emerged slowly, though nothing about him resembled the starving man Clara had served breakfast. He wore a dark coat tailored perfectly to his frame, a silver watch chain resting across his vest, and a hat unmarked by dust. Yet his eyes remained the same storm-gray color, ancient and measuring. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the riders bowed their heads slightly, not in fear but in acknowledgement. The sheriff pushed forward, removing his badge with trembling fingers before offering it in silent respect. Though the drifter waved him off with a small gesture, Clara felt her knees weaken as realization struck her chest like a hammer. The drifter's gaze swept across the gathered crowd until it found her standing in the saloon doorway. Recognition flickered in his expression, subtle but unmistakable. He stepped toward her, boots clicking softly against the wooden boardwalk. Conversations died completely as every citizen watched the most powerful man they had never known. They answered to approach a saloon girl whose kindness had been dismissed as foolishness by nearly everyone in town. When he reached Clara, the drifter removed his hat, revealing neatly combed silver hair and the faint scar along his temple. He asked quietly whether she still carried the coin he had given her. Clara, unable to speak, nodded and placed it into his open palm. He studied it briefly before closing her fingers back around it, repeating the same gentle motion as before, though now it carried the weight of ceremony rather than desperation. He introduced himself simply as Elias Crow, though murmurs spread instantly because the name was legendary across territories. Ranchers whispered that he controlled half the cattle routes between the desert and the mountains. Railroad investors claimed he dictated which towns would survive once tracks expanded westward. Mining corporations allegedly negotiated with him. before sinking their first shovel into the earth. Yet he stood before Clara speaking with quiet gratitude, explaining that her kindness had confirmed something he had searched years to find. Elias turned toward the crowd and announced that Copper Ridge sat on land positioned to become the most profitable junction between three expanding trade routes. He revealed he had purchased controlling stakes in surrounding ranches, water rights, and supply depots over the last decade, operating through agents so no single town could manipulate his investments. He had come disguised, he explained, because he preferred to see communities in their natural state, rather than when they dressed themselves in false hospitality for powerful visitors. He described witnessing greed, cruelty, and indifference during his travels through dozens of settlements. Copper Ridge, he admitted, had shown him much of the same. But Clara's simple act of feeding a stranger without expectation of reward had altered his judgment. The declaration stunned the crowd, especially when he announced plans to build rail access, irrigation systems, and protected trade routes that would transform the struggling mining town into a thriving commercial center. The three well-dressed strangers stepped forward, revealing themselves as Crow's senior advisors, each carrying ledgers thicker than Bibles. They began distributing notices summoning landowners, business operators, and town officials to a meeting scheduled at sunrise. The riders dismounted to secure the streets with silent efficiency, posting guards at water wells, warehouses, and even the sheriff's office, though they did so with professionalism rather than intimidation. As townsfolk dispersed in stunned confusion, Elias lingered beside Clara. He warned her gently that power attracted enemies faster than it created allies. By dawn, he said, some residents would celebrate her, others would blame her for changes they feared, and a few would consider her an obstacle worth removing. He thanked her once more before returning to the wagon, leaving Clara standing beneath flickering lantern light, while the falcon banners snapped in rising desert wind. For the first time since arriving in Copper Ridge, she realized kindness could reshape destinies, but it could also paint a target on the back of the person who offered it. Sunrise over Copper Ridge arrived beneath a sky stained copper and violet, as if the desert itself could not decide whether to bless the town or warn it. Clara barely slept through the night. The weight of everything Elias Crow had revealed pressed against her thoughts, like a storm trapped inside her chest. When she stepped onto the boardwalk outside her small rented room, above the Red Lantern Saloon, she noticed armed riders already stationed at key corners throughout town. They stood motionless, alert but disciplined, their falcon insignias catching the rising sun like silent declarations of new authority. Townsfolk whispered in tight circles, conversations halting whenever Clara walked past. Some nodded respectfully, others turned their backs deliberately, while a few stared at her with thinly disguised resentment. Copper Ridge had awakened to prosperity knocking at its door. Yet prosperity always arrived carrying fear of change, and fear had a way of looking for someone to blame. Inside the saloon, Manny worked in tense silence, polishing glasses that were already spotless. He avoided meeting Clara's eyes until she approached the counter and asked whether he was angry with her. Manny sighed deeply, setting down a glass with careful precision before admitting that he wasn't angry but worried. He explained that towns built on desperation often preferred predictable misery over unpredictable opportunity. He warned her that powerful landowners and mining bosses who had quietly exploited Copper Ridge for years would not surrender control, simply because Elias Crow had decided to reshape the territory. Clara listened carefully, realizing that Manny's warnings came not from bitterness, but from decades spent watching men with dreams disappear into shallow graves or deeper debts. Before she could respond, the saloon doors swung open as several local businessmen entered, their faces tight with forced politeness and unspoken accusations. The businessmen requested Clara's presence at the morning assembly scheduled by Crow's advisors. Their tone remained respectful, yet it carried a stiffness that suggested they saw her as a tool rather than a person. As they escorted her toward the town square, Clara noticed shutters closing along storefronts while groups of miners gathered in uneasy clusters. The meeting took place beneath a temporary canvas pavilion erected overnight by Crow's riders. Ledgers, maps, and land surveys covered long tables arranged with military precision. Elias stood at the center alongside his advisors, calmly reviewing documents while landowners argued about water rights and grazing boundaries. When Claire arrived, conversations faltered momentarily before resuming with sharper undertones. Elias greeted her warmly, inviting her to stand beside him, an action that ignited a visible ripple of irritation among several influential ranchers who believed business decisions should never involve a saloon girl, regardless of her unexpected connection to power. As negotiations unfolded, tensions escalated quickly. Several ranchers accused Crow of attempting to monopolize the region under the disguise of economic progress. Mining representatives argued that expanded rail access would invite external corporations, reducing their exclusive control over mineral extraction. Crow listened patiently, countering each complaint with detailed financial projections showing how infrastructure improvements would multiply profits for nearly everyone involved. Yet logic rarely defeated pride. One rancher named Dalton Graves, known for controlling most of the surrounding cattle drives, rose and declared that Crow's presence threatened the independence of every landowner who had fought to build Copper Ridge with blood and gunpowder. He then turned toward Clara, suggesting that Crow's entire plan rested on the influence of a woman who sold dances and whiskey smiles. The insult struck the pavilion like a thrown knife, leaving silence vibrating in its wake. Before Clara could respond, Elias stepped forward with calm authority that chilled the air more effectively than shouting ever could. He acknowledged Clara's profession without hesitation, stating that dignity came from choices made under hardship, not from titles purchased through inheritance or intimidation. He reminded the assembly that Copper Ridge had been stagnating for years while its so-called leaders lined their pockets and neglected infrastructure that could have secured the town's future. His voice remained even, but each word carried the finality of a judge delivering sentence. Dalton Graves responded by suggesting Crow's reforms would provoke retaliation from rival land syndicates who already contested territory borders. The implication hung heavily over the crowd, hinting at violence creeping closer than anyone wanted to admit. Crow acknowledged the possibility calmly, explaining that such retaliation was already inevitable and that resisting progress would only leave Copper Ridge defenseless. When larger forces moved westward, the meeting dissolved without formal resolution, leaving alliances fractured and suspicions sharpened. As townsfolk dispersed, Clara noticed Graves speaking quietly with several armed men near the livery stable, their expressions tight with calculation. Crow approached Clara privately, admitting that Graves represented only one visible opponent among many unseen rivals who preferred sabotage over negotiation. He revealed intelligence reports suggesting hired guns and corporate agents had already begun moving toward Copper Ridge, intending to disrupt his expansion before it solidified. He warned Clara that her association with him had elevated her from invisible saloon worker to symbolic figure representing his judgment of the town's character. That symbolism, he explained, made her both valuable and vulnerable. As afternoon shadows stretched across the boardwalk, Clara watched groups of strangers entering town disguised as traders and prospectors. For the first time, she felt the full gravity of her simple kindness. It had not only altered her life, it had placed her at the center of a silent war where fortunes, reputations, and lives would soon collide with unforgiving speed.